It's great to be here, and I truly appreciate the honor of receiving the 2014 MRIGlobal Citation Award. I'd like to thank Bill Hall and Tom Bowser and all your colleagues on the board of directors for the honor, and one particular, Jim Spigarelli, who I think probably had a hand in all of this. I want to correct him on one thing, though. He said, you folks have to listen to 3 chemists. It's really 4 chemists. I'm a chemist as well. A chemist who's fallen in, I'm afraid, with diplomats and politicians. What I'd like to do tonight is to talk about the work that I've been doing over most of my career to try to ensure that chemicals are used for the benefit of mankind and not to provide better ways of killing people. This is kind of work, of course. There are hundreds of people that have contributed to this effort. It's a real teamwork and international collaboration. What I'd like to talk about, first of all, is why this still matters. It was 100 years ago. I was reminded when we were over at the World War I Museum today and saw the pictures of poison gas going across the fields in Flanders and seeing the exhibits of the gas masks and the other chemical protective gear. It was 100 years ago that gas was used on a large scale on the battlefield for the first time, really. And I'd like to talk about a little bit why this is still a problem. Talk about the things that have happened since then, through the 20th century and more recently in the last 20 years. So those are the things I'm going to talk about. Why are we still concerned about poison gas? I mean, this is something that happened 100 years ago. Well, the picture on the left is one reason. It's a picture of some of the casualties of a nerve gas attack in the Tokyo subway in March of 1995. A terrorist group, or religious cult actually, Aum Shinrikyo, maybe many of you remember them. They made nerve gas, and they released it in the Tokyo subway, killing 13 people, seriously injuring 50 people, and sending 1,000 people to the hospital. So terrorist use of chemical weapons, of nerve gas, is still a real possibility. The picture on the right shows some of the 1,500 victims, children in this case, 1,500 victims of the nerve gas attack only a year ago, August 21st, 2013, in the Damascus suburb. The Syrian government forces bombed this village, or this suburb, with nerve gas in the early hours of August 21st, 2013. So this is a current problem. This is not something that is simply something from 100 years ago. Since I'm a chemist, I like to show chemical formulas, and I hope the chemists in the audience at least appreciate them. These are the kinds of things we're talking about. The nerve gases soman, tabun, VX, sarin. These are chemicals, as Tom mentioned, that have phosphorus as the key element in the molecular structure. Also, mustard gas causes severe burns. Invented, used heavily in World War I. Still something in, the Syrians had mustard gas, for example. Still a very real threat. And just as an illustration, these kinds of agents have been put into a whole variety of weapon systems. The one you see in the picture happened to be US artillery shells. But a lot of countries have weaponized them. From World War I, and you can see here on the left a picture of British soldiers who have been blinded by chemical agent and only can feel their way along by putting their shoulder on the hands of their buddies. Typifies the heavy use of chemical agents in World War I, roughly 100,000 people killed, many hundreds of thousands injured, many for life by poison gas. Right after the war, there was a real revulsion against poison gas, and people said that it was something we have to prohibit, and they made an effort to do that. What they ended up, though, was a treaty with holes in it, with conditions. People said, well, we won't use it as long as you don't use it first. but if you use it, we're going to retaliate against you. So countries built up stockpiles, and in fact, many countries built up rather substantial stockpiles. What you see on the right, the picture of the weapons there, those are Russian or Soviet weapons. Soviets, in fact, built up the largest chemical weapons program. Fortunately, these chemical weapons were not used in combat. World War II, many military men, I think, expected that the next war, the next great war, would be a chemical war. Fortunately, that didn't turn out to be the case. The chemical weapons were used by the Italians in what was then called Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and by the Japanese in China. In fact, we're still dealing with the consequences of those Japanese attacks and the deployment of chemical weapons in China in the 1940s. Through that period, through the World War II period and afterwards, quite a number of countries built up stockpiles of chemical weapons. And I'll show you a list just so you can get a sense of the scope of the problem in a minute. The first big use of chemical weapons since World War I was, in fact, in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. The Iraqis were trying to deal with essentially Iranian human wave attacks, and so they stopped them with poison gas, with nerve gas, with mustard gas, causing tens of thousands of Iranian casualties. But the Iraqis also used them on their own citizens. The picture you see at the bottom are some of the victims of an attack in the Kurdish village of Halabja in northern Iraq in 1988, March 1988, where roughly 5,000 people were killed by Saddam Hussein's forces attacking Iraqi citizens with poison gas. Here's a list of most of the countries, not all of the countries probably, that developed chemical weapons. Soviet Union had 40,000 tons of nerve gas, mustard gas, lewisite, which is an arsenic-containing blister agent. Keep in mind that the lethal dose for these chemicals is about 10 milligrams. It's about the amount you can put on a pinhead. Soviets had 40,000 tons. The United States had 30,000 tons, huge amounts of chemicals in all sorts of delivery systems, bombs, artillery projectiles. The U.S. had mines, ballistic missile warheads, every kind of weapon system you can think of. Somebody probably tried to put poison gas into it. But who realized that India had chemical weapons, for example, mustard gas? South Korea, in fact, developed binary chemical weapons. Even Albania. When we saw the chemical weapons in Albania, we discovered they had Chinese markings on them. They came from China. Iraq, I've just talked about. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi developed mustard gas. Fortunately, was not able to develop nerve gas, but the list goes on. North Korea still has a substantial chemical weapons program and is not a party to the treaty. You can see all of the others. Lots of countries developed chemical weapons. Now that attack in Halabja in 1988 really galvanized the international community, and they said, we have to put a stop to this. We've been negotiating on a treaty for almost 10 years at that point that really gave the political impetus to finish up the negotiations and to put the prohibition into effect. So what you see there on the upper left is the signature ceremony of the treaty in Paris in January 1993. And the treaty started to actually begin to have the impact that we were looking for. The picture you see there on the upper right, those are Libyan empty rockets. They were not filled with chemicals, fortunately, and easy to destroy. In fact, what we did was just lay them down on a road and run a bulldozer over them. Pretty simple. Unfortunately, getting rid of a lot of the other chemical weapons was not so simple. Your tax dollars have paid for about $30 billion worth of effort. Very large facilities, a number of places in the United States. Right now we're building 2 facilities, one in Pueblo, Colorado, the other in Bluegrass, Kentucky. Capital investment cost for each of those facilities is well over $1 billion, and the operating costs on top of that. And both of those facilities will start operating in the the next few years and destroy the remaining amounts of the U.S. stockpile. Jim mentioned, I think, that the organization was, for its efforts in eliminating chemical weapons as a threat, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize last year. What you see there is the Director General of the organization, the head of the organization, Ahmed Azumcu, Ambassador Azumcu, holding the Nobel Prize citation and the medal. Now let me talk about this extraordinary agreement, because it is quite extraordinary. It provides a total prohibition, no exceptions. All the countries that sign on to the treaty, and now, as it was mentioned, there are 190 countries, have agreed to completely renounce chemical weapons, to say that these are no longer legitimate weapons that can be used on the battlefield. Everyone has to declare what they have, if they have, destroy their stockpiles, destroy their production facilities. This has been a Herculean effort. I've just mentioned where the United States is in the process. The United States has destroyed roughly 90% of its stocks and will destroy the remaining amount over the next, half dozen years. The Russians are in a very similar position, but have not destroyed quite as much. Destroyed about 80%, and they will take until, just told us they will take until 2020 to get rid of the rest of their stockpiles. One of the differences with chemical weapons, weapons using toxic chemicals, is, compared to nuclear weapons, for example, is there's a very large civilian industry, civilian chemical industry, a key economic driver in the United States and elsewhere, but also which possesses a lot of facilities that could be used to make poison gas. How do you make sure that these facilities are not being misused? Well, we've established in this treaty for the first time an extensive regime for monitoring the chemical industry, inspections of certain kinds of chemical facilities, checking their records, looking at their production equipment to make sure that no one is misusing them for purposes that are prohibited by the treaty. We've established an international monitoring regime. The organization has roughly 150 inspectors coming from all over the world that goes out to inspect chemical industry facilities, goes out to inspect stockpiles, destruction facilities. And I think almost every week there is an inspection in the United States, either of the chemical industry or of our storage sites or the destruction activities. In fact, once we begin destroying chemical weapons again, the inspectors will be present continuously until that destruction is completed. Same thing in Russia and other countries that are destroying stockpiles. But in addition to destroying stockpiles, we recognize that countries that feel vulnerable need assistance as well. Countries that feel threatened by chemical weapons, they don't have chemical weapons themselves, need assistance, providing protection, getting training in protecting themselves against toxic chemicals. This is expanding now beyond the strictly military chemical weapons threat to assisting countries in dealing with other kinds of incidents with toxic chemicals, whether they're terrorist incidents or accidents. It's a real example of international cooperation. 190 countries, we take decisions, believe it or not. Imagine 190 countries taking decisions by consensus. In other words, if anybody objects, we keep talking until we agree. It takes a lot of patience, a lot of sitting in meetings. But so far, we've had very few occasions on which we had to take a vote. Very unusual in international organizations, but it's part of the culture. And of course, we've established a new international organization. It has roughly 500 employees, 150 inspectors, people from all over the world. Not as many Americans as I would like, but it's an organization that I think over the years has proven itself, in contrast to some international organizations I could mention, to be a very lean and efficient way of getting business done. What have we accomplished? Well, we have reached agreement. I mean, this is an international consensus that these are not legitimate weapons, that no one should have them. 190 countries have signed on to that. No one that I can think of, no country even the ones outside the treaty, would argue that these are legitimate weapons. We've confirmed the destruction of tens of thousands of tons of mustard gas, nerve gas, other kinds of toxic chemicals, lewisite. We've established confidence that the chemical industry around the world is not being misused to produce better ways of killing people using toxic chemicals. This, in addition, helps promote international trade, international cooperation, stimulates really growth in the chemical industry in developing countries. We've built up very extensive programs for international cooperation, not only in assisting people in building protection against chemical weapons, but helping to promote the development of chemical industry around the world in developing countries and promoting cooperation in science. And in effect, what we've done is established a very good model for international cooperation in strengthening security. What has happened over these 100 years is there's been a real change in the way people think about chemical weapons. Back in World War I, in fact, the German chemical program was led by a very famous chemist, Fritz Haber, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1919 for his work on fixation of nitrogen from the atmosphere, enabling the production of nitrogen fertilizers. He said it was a higher form of killing. He was acting in revulsion against the carnage, the slaughter he saw on the battlefield, and thought he had invented a better way of killing people. By the 1980s, many of you remember the DuPont slogan, better things for better living through chemistry. And I think that really represents what we're trying to do. But here's where the problems come in. Despite all the success we've had, as I mentioned, roughly a year ago, the Syrians started using nerve gas in fighting their own civil war. Here you see some of the victims wrapped in shrouds from that August 21st, 2013 attack. This led to an international investigation by the UN, which confirmed, using analytical chemistry techniques, the same kinds of techniques that were developed here at MRI, to detect very low trace levels of nerve agent, allowing the international community to understand who had used the chemicals. Now, going ahead, there are a lot of technical challenges. As we learn more about how biochemical systems in the body work, the very elaborate, delicate, and interlocked chemical reactions of living systems, it means there are more and more ways to disrupt these, to design ways to block pathways, to cause them to fail. There are new manufacturing methods. The chemical industry itself has reorganized itself. Chemicals are being produced in different ways. There are things, microreactors, very small reactors. We tend to think when we were establishing the treaty of very large facilities, which basically single-purpose facilities, very designed to contain highly toxic chemicals. That's not the problem we face anymore. There are much smaller facilities, more flexible facilities. So the evolution of the verification methods has to track the evolution of the threat. And there are technical threats from non-state actors. Mustard gas is not difficult to make chemically. And there are certainly people, Al-Qaeda and ISIL, that are trying to do that. There are political challenges as well. There are still some states outside the treaty, North Korea being the most prominent example, that has a large chemical weapons program. But there are others too, which are thought to have either chemical weapons or the capability to make chemical weapons on short notice. So we need to deal with that. When I talk about adaptation to a new security environment, well, the treaty was negotiated at a time when we thought the problem was Warsaw Pact versus NATO. The threat was in Europe. That's not the way the security situation looks today. It's much more fragmented, and there's no single dominant actor in every case. It's a very diffuse threat. And of course, there are threats from non-state actors. Now, I want to talk a little bit about responsibilities of scientists as well. It's not only governments that are responsible for making chemical weapons. The chemicals, the ways of delivering them, are developed by chemists and chemical engineers. And so to preserve this norm, this is something that should not be done, is a responsibility of chemists, individual chemists, and chemical engineers as well. Now, I've talked about Fritz Haber, world-class chemist, who was the one that promoted the use of chemical weapons in World War I. But you probably don't know much about Dr. Clara Immerwahr, the lady on the right. When she realized what was being done with chemistry, she killed herself. She was Dr. Haber's wife. Now I want to, despite all the kind things that have been said about my role, this is the kind of work that really requires teamwork, a lot of people in a lot of countries over a long period of time. And I've been very fortunate to work in my own delegation with some very committed and dedicated and skillful professionals over the years. And I want to show you a picture of some of them in a minute. But one other thing I've learned is that it's serious work, and you have to take it very seriously, but if you take yourself too seriously, you get into trouble. And we've tried to follow that philosophy. So let me show you my team. There we are. That was Halloween a year or two ago. So thanks very much for listening. I'd invite your questions. And Tom Sack, I think, has a whole fistful of questions for me.
Okay, so the first question is, what is the score of the ball game? And
that's the one you were supposed to answer.
That's right, and I have the answer. It's 1-0 Orioles, bottom of the fourth, and it looked like Kane was on second with Butler up to bat. I don't know how many outs, but so it's looking good. So first off, we got a handful of questions here that we'll start with. The first is, should science have a greater role in public policy and decision making?
Well, you know, I would say in most things I wouldn't leave the decisions to the scientists. But I would say that there are a lot of fields where having the facts, knowing the facts, is critical to reaching a good decision. I've seen a lot of decisions that have been made simply on the basis of emotion and the spirit of the moment without people asking for the facts. So I'd say yes, absolutely.
Well, we agree. Scientists should be involved in all the decisions. How does the convergence of chemistry and biology affect the development of future weapons treaties? I think you touched a bit on that.
Well, a little bit. You know, as we've come to see that chemistry is essentially taking over biology slowly. Things are being described in terms of the reactions and the receptors and so on. In fact, it was striking that the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2 years ago, I think, was awarded for what sounded very much to me like a biological discovery, that is, certain protein coupled receptors. There is a treaty banning biological weapons, which was reached in the mid-1970s. It doesn't have the kind of elaborate verification system that I mentioned. Now, I can't get rid of that. If you could just shut off the slides. And it deals with microbes and other biological agents. Those are the terms that are used. Mm-hmm. The Chemical Weapons Treaty, of course, deals with toxic chemicals, but the two treaties fortunately overlap. They both cover toxins, poisonous chemicals that are originally derived from living systems. You think of botulinum toxin, for example, or ricin. Both are covered by both treaties. I don't expect that there will be a new treaty negotiated because of this convergence. I think what we're going to have to do is figure out how to deal with things like, well, you heard last year, Dr. Venter talking about what in effect was the chemical synthesis of living organisms, putting together more and more complicated chemicals until you have something that is self-reproducing. There's the opposite kind of thing, where people are splicing genes into algae or into yeasts or bacteria in order to produce a simple chemical. How we're going to deal with these things, the same kind of verification system is not going to work. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about large facilities producing hundreds of tons of chemicals, probably, much smaller quantities, much smaller facilities. Mm-hmm. So I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but we're working on it.
Okay, what actions does the OPCW take to ensure that Syria's chemical industry, assuming it's run by the Syrian government, can no longer manufacture chemical weapons in the future?
Well, right now there isn't much happening in the Syrian chemical industry. We've taken a look. They have a few fertilizer production facilities, urea production facilities, I think that we wouldn't worry too much about. But, and in fact, I don't think they're operating either. But once the conflict ends and Syria starts resuming a more normal industrial kind of activity, OPCW inspectors will be at inspecting each of their chemical production facilities to make sure that they're not being misused. Mm-hmm. So they will come under the industry verification regime.
And then this is a more personal question. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in shifting from chemistry to diplomacy?
Well, this is partly a setup. We talked about this before.
Yeah.
You know, chemists, scientists are problem solvers. You got something you don't know the answer to, and you're trying to find out the answer to understand something. And if you have too big a problem, you break it down into smaller problems and you try to solve those. I've discovered that in the political world, sometimes the problems are too big. You can't solve the Palestine issue, for example. People try to manage things, keep them from getting worse, work on it, try to make it better. But also, sometimes you run across situations where people don't want to solve problems. They actually, problems serve their interests. And getting used to that tension, you know, I figured, problem, you want to solve it. Mm-hmm. Not everybody thinks that way.
Mm-hmm. I think I've run into people like that. They thrive on having problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we'll do one more, and this one is probably it's directed at our young audience members. Okay. And what advice would you offer the high school students in the audience?
Well, I guess I could offer the same advice that I gave my kids when they went out the door to school. Work hard, learn something, but that's not really. What I would say is, you know, I've been fortunate that I've been allowed and been able, through some teachers in particular, to develop this kind of mixed interest at the interface between science and politics. I've pursued what I thought was interesting, and that's my advice to high school students, I guess. Find something that you're really interested in and pursue it. It's certainly philosophy that's worked well for me.
Yeah. Well, very good. Dr. Mikulak, thank you very, very much. We appreciate it.